Good afternoon. Please take a seat. I'm Noah Sobey, President-elect of CIS, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the George F. Neller Lecture. At CIS, we have lots of parallel sessions, but this is one of two plenary events that we have at CIS 2017. The second takes place this evening at 6:15 in this room. Mark Bray will present the presidential address titled Schooling and Its Supplements, Changing Global Patterns and Implications for Comparative Education. But we're gathered here for the George F. Neller Lecture, which is generously established by an endowment bequest from Professor Neller. And today we continue in the long-standing tradition of offering a conference-wide lecture on current topics really important to our field. And it's a great honor to have Antonio Novoa delivering this year's Neller Lecture. Professor Novoa has been president of the University of Lisbon between 2006 and 2013. He earned a PhD in education from the University of Geneva and a second PhD in history from the University of Paris-Sorbonne. He is a full professor of the Institute of Education of the University of Lisbon. He has been a visiting professor at several American and European universities and UNESCO consultant in the field of education. He works on the fields of history of education and comparative education, with particular emphasis on the teaching profession and educational policies. Professor Novoa was also a candidate in the 2016 presidential election in Portugal, and by just 2% of the vote was not elected president of Portugal, which gives particular saliency, poignancy to the talk he will deliver today, which is titled Comparative Education, Disillusions, Politics, and Knowledge. Please join me in welcoming Professor Novoa to the stage.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to Noah Sobey, to all the participants in this conference. It's a great pleasure to be here, a great pleasure and also a great responsibility to stand before you and to try to say a couple of messages in a so difficult time of our lives, a time of shadows, a time of new wars against freedom, against diversity, against what makes us humans. What brings me here, I told that to Noah, is the commitment to always put humanity first. Humanity at peace with the other and at peace with hers, as stated by Michel Serres. We may not want to see, but the worst of the blind are those who seeing don't see. We may not want to hear, but the sirens are playing loudly. To know is all we have left. Today, more than ever, our effort is to try to understand even if it is by incomplete pieces, by fragments. To the genius in his workshop, the interruption, the severe blow of fate is the same as the gentle handle of sleep. It captures the magic circle thereof in a fragment. Genius is diligence, says Walter Benjamin. Yes, genius is diligence, hard work, like the one that has been accomplished in the field of comparative education, a field that reveals great vivacity and energy. Yes, we can meet ourselves today with a sense of accomplishment, quite evident in the remarkable International Handbook of Comparative Education, edited by Robert Cohen, Andreas Casamillas, present here in this room, and I thank you very much for this, as well as in the program of this conference. But we have a problem. a problem that runs throughout our collective history, the dangerous liaisons between politics and knowledge. This problem is not just ours, I know. But when we go through other fields of comparative research, like comparative literature or comparative law or comparative sociology or even comparative politics, one easily realizes that it is a problem that reaches in a very special way the field of comparative education. Why? Well, certainly for many reasons that Cohen and Casamillas present in their international handbook, from the meliorist motive to the intentionally reformative ambition. This ghost, which has always hunted comparative education, is the reason for many of our illusions and disillusions, or even delusions. I am using here a hermaphrodite concept because these illusions contain illusions, or better still, illusions contain illusions. Here is one of the definitions given by the American Heritage College Dictionary. Illusion is the condition of being deceived by an illusion. Under this definition, illusion is equal to disillusion. That's why it is so important to try to understand. That is why I want to begin this talk with a reference to one of the French leading authors who, in 1986, published the book on the main theme of this conference, entitled Has Education Been Democratized? I summarize the conclusions of Antoine Proulx in his radical honesty. I believe, says Antoine Proulx, I have shown that democratization progressed until the early 60s in a school structure thought by conservatives with a strictly reactionary will, while, on the contrary, later reforms, which wanted to ensure the equality of opportunities before school and the democratization of education, have in fact organized the recruitment of the school elite in the social elite. These results, say Antoine Proulx, do not rejoice me, but it seems to me that they are clearly demonstrate. I was, in the earlier 60s, a convinced supporter of these reforms, whose effects, unfortunately, contradict our intentions. To try to understand, it is our job. For this, we have to take risks, even to transgress. It is not worth to repeat the same dichotomies, the same divisions, the same methods, the same certainties. If we already know everything, there is no room for knowledge. We can only think through ignorance. The firmness of one margin of the river or of the other margin of the river, it's of little avail. We stay prisoners of the banks. Yes, we need the turbulence of the third margin. And the third margin is the journey, is the river itself. I have always written like a troubadour, says Michel Serres, or even like a Gouliard. I have, who knows? After these introductory words, I will advance to part one about 3 dates and 3 dissolutions of comparative education. Then I will make an intermezzo before developing part 2, fundamentally on the need to rethink our conceptions of space and time and its relationships. I will end with some closing arguments about politics and knowledge. Allow me then to enter into the core of my discussion. To do so, I will use 3 symbolic dates for comparative education in order to identify 3 distinct movements, all of them ending with a sense of disillusion or at least of incompleteness. No, I will not go back to the date of 1817, the esquisse, the outline of Marc-Antoine Julien de Paris, because it's too well known and already the subject of many studies on the bicentenary of its publication. Furthermore, I don't want to exhaust myself in an endless quest for origins. But there are 3 other dates, every 50 years, less celebrated, but still worthy of mention. And those dates are 1867, 1917, 1967. I will draw attention to 3 processes that combine with each other, revealing important phases of educational comparison: to imagine, to predict, and to prescribe. Let me begin with the first date, 1867, the World Exhibition of Paris, to imagine, the catalogue of school modernization. Gustave Flaubert, the acclaimed French novelist, wrote in his Dictionary of Accepted Ideas the following entry: exhibition, cause of lunacy in the 19th century. And he was right. These exhibitions were the vitrine in which the great novelties of the school and its modernization were presented. The 1867 exhibition consolidates the belief in education, but also the need to create a rational school organization from knowledge validated and legitimized through the best examples in the world. The overview of the educational section of the exhibition leaves no doubt. It must be, they say, a school Louvre, a museum of the school, in which, and I quote, all ideas, all actions, all foundations, all pedagogical works, all books and methods, all school materials are presented in order to make up for lost time and to launch school modernization. The Paris exhibition displays an imaginary in the sense of a catalogue of images that comes to define our idea of school and above all to foster new educational policies. The image is knowledge. Knowledge through exposition and comparison, and imposes itself as a fundamental political element. But instead of multiplying the images, the catalogue hierarchizes them and constructs an imaginary of progress. It is the first moment of a first disillusion. The display of the catalogue of school modernization did not contribute to difference, but instead to similarity and sameness. Yet, we all know that if it's not a science of difference, comparison will be nothing. Let me move to a second moment, 50 years later, a less obvious date, but important to my discussion. 1917, the death of Émile Durkheim, to predict the composition of science. We all know the popular French saying, comparaison n'est pas raison. Comparison is not reason. A saying that Roland Barthes turns upside down when talking about himself. He is talking about himself in the quote that I'm going to share with you. He does not invent. He does not combine. He translates. For him, Comparison is reason. It takes pleasure in deporting the object by a kind of imagination that it's more homological than metaphorical. We compare systems, not images. But Durkheim, as we all know, had already started this movement, namely with his famous thesis that comparative sociology is not a special branch of sociology, it is sociology itself, insofar as it ceases to be purely descriptive and aspire to account for facts. Durkheim, Émile Durkheim, is commonly cited as one of the founding fathers of modern social science. But less attention has been paid to his writings on education, despite the fact that he was indeed professor of education and not of sociology. In the famous dictionary of Ferdinand Buisson, published at the end of the 19th century, and then in the new edition at the beginning of the 20th century, Durkheim sought to define the meaning of a science of education precisely from the comparative perspective. Thus, after presenting examples of classifications and types of education established through comparison, he summarizes his proposal. Once the types are established, we need to explain them. That is to say, to look for the conditions on which depend the properties of each of them. This would give rise to the laws that dominate the evolution of education systems. We could then see, and in what sense, education has developed, and what are the causes which have organized this development. The composition of a comparative science of education would be based on these laws of education. The definition of explanatory models and nomothetic causal relation would allow for the transfer of policies and educational solutions. It is known for all of us how this illusion has multiplied throughout the 20th century, taking as a high point the work of Noah and Eckstein toward a science of comparative education. Believing in laws that can be generalized regardless of roots and contexts, led to the second great dissolution of comparative education. Finally, I would like to jump again 50 years to address briefly a last and current dissolution. 1967, the legal foundation of the International Association for the Evaluation of Educational Achievement, to prescribe the celebration of numbers. First, to describe, through a catalogue that creates an imaginary of the school modernization. Then, to predict, through the definition of laws which should serve as guides to the reform of educational systems. Now, to construct powerful evaluation devices, celebrating numbers, and exposing them directly to public in different countries. Dataism, the new religion, imposes on us the conformity of what works, naturally, simply, obviously. Three developments are particularly important and significant, and all of them will gain a very sophisticated form in the most important instrument of educational policy in the world, the PISA program. First, all efforts are focused on evaluation, that is, as we all know, the touchstone of any educational change. Second, this evaluation is of the national systems, but through the students' performance, which gives to this program a very special feature. Third, the assessment is not done through data organized by the different countries, but through an apparatus designed centrally and applied nationally. This kind of global metrics is not done. This kind of global metrics gains a new dimension thanks to the technological possibilities that exist today and becomes more powerful thanks to the intensive use of the media. These programs induce, as we all know, a kind of mimesis which the power of the media and the competitive atmosphere makes almost inevitable. In this way, comparison becomes a dominant instrument of global educational governance, leading each national state to follow the paths indicated by PISA. Policy prescription is not made through any normative or authoritarian process, but instead allowing each national state, in its freedom, of course, to do what is right, to do what needs to be done, to do what works. This strange and dangerous connection between knowledge and politics is bringing a third disillusion to comparative educational research. Dear friends and colleagues, it's time to conclude this first part of my talk and to move on to the second part. Before, however, I would like to ask what brings together these three moments, these three disillusions. There are several possible answers, of course, but the one I wish to shed light on is the belief in the existence of a solution for the educational problems. Whether this solution is an example to follow, the example that occupies the top place in the catalogue of images, whether this solution is a law which can be applied to different realities, whether this solution is a classification that hierarchizes countries according to the performance of their students. These three processes are not independent. They are interconnected. They are always present in one way or another. All of them lead to the idea of a quantification of the world and the quantification of the social that goes through the movements of modernization in 19th and 20th centuries, ending up now with the neoliberal construction of late capitalism. This quantification relies on a linear vision of space and time, inherited from a colonial logic which transports a clear hierarchy of the world. Rethinking space and time allow us to go beyond the authoritarianism of quantification, measurability and accountability, but also to go beyond a comparison that through catalogues, through laws, and through classifications contributes largely to this authoritarianism. That is why, in the second part of this talk, I will concentrate on an analysis of space and time, the two central dimensions of comparison. From here, I hope we can open new understandings about comparative research, because we need a more problematized comparative education, less worried with things and more involved with problems. Of course, in order to do something, a thing must exist. And that is why our research has always an empirical basis. But our work is not about things. It's about the problematization of things. And that's why I would like to begin this second part in the simplest way possible, even at the risk of not being fully understood. We need to build a different understanding of space and time, of space-time relationships. We need to do it recognizing that it's at the core of our comparative work. Recognizing that I'm oversimplifying my arguments, I will sustain that we need to conceive space as spatialities and time as temporalities. From space to spatialities. The most important space for educational comparison has always been and always remain the national state. This space has been diversified with reference to other space, from the local to the global, from micron comparison to transnationalization studies, opening up new comparative frameworks. In the last decades, the growing awareness of globalization has been particularly relevant, giving rise to an academic environment wherein everything seemed to flow, seemed to connect, to communicate, to move easily, smoothly. Studies on cosmopolitanism, hybridization, spatial fluidity, liquid identities, and so on, took over intellectual debates. It was as if the end of history had arrived to academia, and the post-national era had imposed itself forever. But suddenly, history seems to have wakened up, though not for the best reasons, as if we were waking up from an hangover which stresses now the need to reconnect again with politics and with democratic engagement. 2 lines of work proved to be very intense during the last 2 or 3 decades. The first one relates to the work linking the local to the global, the famous glocalization, using this term or another one. It doesn't matter. Today, however, this division needs to be overcome. We can almost say that now the local is the world, and that we have to think about the different spatialities that exist in a space that has been dramatically reduced. It is not so much a matter of thinking about the different logics of transfer, of export and import, of lending and borrowing, but rather of understanding how we all, through our own network presence and collaboration, contribute first to the localization and then to the relocalization of policies in different spatialities. It is not about a space without locations, but instead about a space with multiple locations. In this sense, and I will not go through this argument, but in this sense, the intercessor of Gilles Deleuze is also the interceptor of Roland Barthes. The one that intercedes is also the one that intercepts. The second line of work that has proved intense in recent years is the attention given to the dematerialization of space with a more complex analysis of flows, communications, networks, connections, and so on. However, these studies tend to accentuate fluidity as if it was fluctuation. That is, they don't pay due attention to key dimensions brought to the scientific debate by authors like Kenneth Singh or Tim Creswell. I am referring to the concepts of friction and turbulence. Kenneth Singh explains that without friction, movement would be impossible. The surfaces would slide into each other in a frictionless fluidity that would make any kind of traction impossible, and without traction, there is no movement. Likewise, Tim Creswell, working on mobilities, invites us not to see turbulence as a moment of breakdown, a fundamentally bad thing, but rather, he says, as an event of creative potentiality. Moments of turbulence produce sudden visibilities in systems that would otherwise remain mostly invisible and taken for granted. I believe that these movements are essential to broaden up the possibilities of comparative work in education. Using a metaphor, it is as if we need to unwrap space to understand the different spatialities that exist in a given space. We cannot close our thinking in a dichotomous logic of the local versus the global, nor fool the idea of fluidity without friction and turbulence. We cannot let ourselves to become encapsulated neither in a physical view of space nor in an endless fluidity. To understand is to localize, is to position, and therefore, as Casamias has stated very often, there is no comparison outside historical thinking. One, that it's not a history of events, that it's not a history of things, but a historical understanding of how education operates in different spatialities. From space to spatialities, from time to temporalities. Here again, once more, we cannot trust the sense. We are watching a compression of time, also in the ways how we think, as if we were witnessing a perpetual time, or what is the same, a time without time. Much of the comparative work has fallen into this illusion. In his brilliant essay, 24/7, 24 hours, 7 days a week, Jonathan Crary talks about a generalized inscription of human life in duration without breaks, defined by a principle of continuous functioning. It is a time, he says, that no longer passes beyond clock times. There is a simultaneous process of compression of social time and deceleration of individual time, which prevent us from understanding the different temporalities in which the educational processes are organized. That is why it is necessary to unfold time, to work in the different layers of time. Throughout this unfolding, it is possible to grasp the turbulence of events of intensive change in their relation with the long duration. In doing so, we understand the resonance of events in different temporalities, opening up the range of our understandings. There is no resonance without turbulence, without interruption, without friction. A continuous time is a time without history. It's a time of repetition, of reiteration, without invention, without creation, without the possibility of thinking otherwise. If we do not inscribe our thinking in time, we will not be able to understand education. But this inscription should not close us in time. This inscription is our friction, our traction to get out of an empty, useless thought. By giving back time to time, we escape a vaporous comparison which evaporates before our eyes. Without history, there is no comparison. Walter Benjamin said it remarkably in his unfinished Arcades project, and I'm quoting, comparison of the other people's attempts to the understanding of a sea voyage in which the ships are drawn off course by the magnetic North Pole. Discover this North Pole. What for others are deviations are for me the data which determine my course. On the differentials of time, which for others disturb the main line of the inquiry, I base my reckoning. Spatialities, temporalities, the differentials of space, the differentials of time, without new understandings of space and time, of space-time relationships, will not be able to escape the illusions and disillusions of comparative research. Setting a clock. How many centimeters have a minute? Let me say it clearly. Now that I'm nearing the end of this talk, we'll not be able to problematize inequality if we close ourselves in the traditional spaces of comparison. Comparing countries will not help us to understand inequalities. Within each country, there are many countries, many realities. Within each city, there are very different cities. Within each neighborhood, within each place. If we fail to recognize the different specialities that coexist in the same space, the different temporalities that coexist at the same time, we can hardly advance to new ways of thinking. But we also be unable to understand inequality if we let ourselves be dragged by a global comparison, by an endless fluidity, a space without space, a time without time. It is in the unfolding of space, it is in the multiplication of time, in the construction of new ways of looking, new ways of seeing, and of saying that we can finally start a new momentum for comparative education. I spoke of the problematization of inequality, but I could have talked about curriculum policies. We will not understand anything only from a national vision or from a global perspective. And the same can be said for all the other educational issues. Education today is defined in very different ways, different spaces, different times. And it is in the understanding of this difference, in this multiplicity, that lies the main challenge of comparative education. Please allow me 5 minutes to conclude. Nowadays, as I have argued elsewhere, politics tend to be defined through spectacularity and through mutual accountability. Let me say the same thing in a very different way. George Orwell was wrong. Big Brother doesn't exist. We are the Big Brother. We all expose ourselves all the time. We all watch each other at all times, an endless watching. The total, and maybe, who knows, irreversible panopticon is a reticular mantle woven daily by our own hands. A mantle that lives from its permanent exposure. A mantle built through collaboration. It is not conspiracy. It is an interviewing of free wills. The only escape would be exile in an underworld which would not be built in an immense basement of the earth, but only in an implausible life outside the net. And what is true for individuals is also true for politics. Spectacularity, mutual accountability. There is no possible underworld, but there is a possible way out. And allow me to use in this moment an extraordinary lecture given precisely 35 years ago in March 1982 by Maxim Green on public education and the public space. And I quote, "To rear a generation of spectators is not to educate at all. I cannot imagine a coherent sense of purpose in education if something common does not arrive in a public space. I cannot imagine a coherent sense of purpose in education if something common does not arise in a public space. This is our way out. This is what we can do. Instead of believing in a linear relationship between knowledge and politics, instead of turning comparison into a mode of governance, we can value and broaden a public space for discussion and deliberation. Science is not democratic, obviously, but there is no democracy without science, without diligent work, without understanding the problems, leading us to involvement, to commitment, to deliberation in a common space. This is the space of democracy. This is the space of democratic engagement. I turn now to a very old criticism on the 70s made by Ivan Illich when he said that experts and an expert culture always calls for more experts. Experts have a tendency to curtailize themselves by creating institutional barricades and to control knowledge production as they decide what a valid and legitimate knowledge is and how its diffusion should be organized. One must not expect comparative education to reinforce this logic of experts, but on the contrary, to contribute for the reappropriation of knowledge and politics, to contribute for strengthening a public space for discussion and deliberation. Ivan Illich speaks about conviviality. An important work has recently been done on the new commons, on communality. What I want to emphasize at the end of my talk is the importance of commons in policy formation. This is how our knowledge can contribute to the deepening of a public space of discussion and deliberation. It is from this commitment that we can exercise our craft as thinkers, as problematizers of education. We all know here in the audience that in Europe and around the world, we have heard many times that the banks are too big to fail. That means that we need to pay the problems of the banks. It seems to me that some of us in academia have given up to the huge dimension of most of the issues that we face today. And sometimes, maybe, we think that the problems are too big to think. But they are not. They are never too big to think. We should not claim to be SSS, specialists, specially specialized. We should claim instead to be troubadours, like Michel Serres, troubadours of knowledge. And this requires to take risks. But what would be knowledge without risk? Discovery, maybe. But more important than that discovering things is to see, to discover our vision of the things. And to see, we need to multiply our vision, our understanding of space and time. Here is what I have come to share with you. Something that, in fact, is already in a couple of lines of one of the most remarkable books of the 20th century, In Search of Lost Time. A book that some people say that it's impossible to read before one turns 40, and when we do, we no longer have the time to read it. All I can say now is a big thank you for your invitation and also for your kind attentions. Perhaps instead of this lecture, I could have just made the following quote. It would be remembered, of course, in that case, as the fastest keynote lecture in the history of CIES. Right? I did not have the courage to do it, but I leave you now with Marcel Proust, In Search of a Lost Time. A pair of wings, a different mode of breathing, which should enable us to traverse infinite space, would in no way help us, for if we visit Mars or Venus keeping the same senses, they would close in the same aspect as the things of the earth, everything that we should be capable of seeing. The only true voyage of discovery would be not to visit strange lands. I would say, not to discover things, not to visit strange lands, but to possess other eyes, to behold the universe through the eyes of another, of 100 others, to behold the 100 universe that each of them beholds, that each of them is. This phrase, this sentence, I believe, could well be the motto for comparative education. To see through the eyes of another, to see of 100 eyes, to see through the eyes of another, of 100 others, to behold the 100 universe that each of them beholds, that each of them is. Maybe it could be this sentence of Marcel Proust, the motto for comparative education. Thank you, and thank you, and thank you.
Thank you, Antonio, for a lecture that was magisterial, symphonic, elegant, that intercepts and intercedes into conversations that are occurring across this conference, and that challenges and inspires us as troubadours of knowledge. Thank you again.